Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I'm here, as always, with B'nai Lappi for another episode of the Oral Talmud. And today we are here with a guest. We've had a number of guests on this show that have been Talmudic scholars or activists or professors of Talmud. And this is our first guest who is not one of those, but he is a professor. Our guest today is Professor Richard Primus, who is a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. And I should say also one of my oldest friends. So Richard, we're really excited to have you here today to talk about some of the connections between how constitutional and just legal, American legal interpretation works and what's going on in the Talmud, which are things that B'nai and I have talked about throughout the 40 some odd episodes that we've done. So we're really excited to have you here to really talk about that more formally. So thanks so much for being with us.
Great. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for asking. I'm a big fan of the project, and I'm a big fan of each of your work. And it's always fun, Dan, to talk to you about these things. And as you know, like I think about constitutional law all the time for a living and otherwise. And one of the things that I know I am usually doing when I do that is thinking about Jewish law analogs. So I'm delighted to be here having the conversation.
Yeah, well, I would say that the one place where you definitely do have some Talmudic chops that I remember very well from college is when you wrote a page of Talmud, as if I recall correctly, this was about 30 years ago, that was about whether the lumpy or the smooth salad dressing was the appropriate form of salad dressing in the Hillel dining hall. So
yes, I did that. I was on a crusade, I remember, through Harvard Hillel to ban the dressing that I referred to as the lumpy and gross dressing. And I tried various argumentative tactics, right? And it's true. In fact, I think I still have the document, but I wrote that document. I then created Gemara on the document to explain the punchline of which, of course, was if you don't have to use dressing at all, but if you do, use the creamy smooth one and not the lumpy gross one. And I found the Talmudic forum a really effective one, I think, for getting to the conclusion.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because our most recent guest was Menachem Fish, who is a professor of actually the philosophy of science, but he's also written about Talmud. And one of his takes on the Gemara is that it's actually the project of the Gemara not to come to conclusions, and that those places where you see that it does come to a conclusion is probably a later insertion by a late editor who wasn't comfortable with that. And that after the Talmud was closed, the people who came after it kind of messed the whole thing up by trying to create law codes and halachic decisions when the whole Talmud's point was we need to be able to live with ambiguity. Anyway, let's move on to more serious topics. But I do want to say, like, that was very memorable. It was 30 years ago. But here's where I'm really coming from this conversation, and why we really wanted to talk to you and potentially other law professors in the future, is that I feel like the Jewish project that I don't know exactly if I want to call it a legal project. I think that might be a somewhat of a misunderstanding of what the Talmud is about. But let's put it in that category, at least for this conversation, to say, like, I think that the project of Jewish law as understood by the kind of world of rabbinic education over the last X period of time, I mean modern times, is not benefiting from the kind of discoveries or ideas that flow out of American legal and maybe Anglo-American legal academia. In other words, that there are ways of thinking about how one interprets a text, or how one should, or the limitations of one's ability to interpret a text, that are some of the bread and butter in law schools today, that aren't really the bread and butter of most rabbinical schools today, and certainly not the more, let's say, on the Orthodox spectrum, who have a much more simple notion of how one looks at a text and asks this question: what are we supposed to do? And to some extent, that's what I want to bring out in this conversation. I thought sort of one general question that I could ask you to start it off a little bit, but feel free to take this where you want to take it, is I know you've done a lot of work on this topic of originalism. And this idea that, at least in America, up until recently, and I think thanks to your work to a large extent, people generally think of originalism as a conservative move in interpreting a text, interpreting a constitutional text. That originalism is something that conservatives do, and you've written some about how that's not necessarily the case. And I think that the way to see a tool like originalism, which maybe you could explain a little bit, but a tool like that as not necessarily leading only to one substantive type of outcome, but actually just a tool that can be used in both directions, I think would be a little bit of a helpful way into this question of seeing some of the connections between things that we talk about here about the Talmud and just how all legal systems tend to work, and how sophisticated legal thinkers of today are teaching us to understand some of those moves.
Okay, I should say that we should differentiate between ideas about legal interpretation and about originalism in constitutional law as they exist at the forefront of the legal academy, and the practice of originalism as engaged in by judges and other constitutional decision makers, and also in the lay public, because it's an activity that people engage in also in political forums and around dinner tables also, and the practice in many ways might resemble what you're thinking of as the Jewish practice more closely than the sort of like leading edge academic stuff does, which is also true in what B'nai does. But so let's say a few things about it. In constitutional law, originalism is not just one thing. It's the surname of a family of approaches, right? Both in theory and practice to constitutional law. And like other families, it has multiple members who are alike in some important ways, but no two of whom are exactly the same as each other either, right? And if you ask, what do originalisms have in common? The general answer is originalism approaches the Constitution on the understanding that the legally authoritative content of the Constitution is a function of facts in existence at the time of the enactment of the constitutional text. Most originalists in the law are also textualists. That means they think the legally authoritative meaning of the Constitution is locked into the meaning of the text at the moment of enactment. But originalism and textualism are actually conceptually separate, right? They're not the same thing. They have differing ideas about the locus of authority, right? Is the locus of authority the document itself, right? That's textualism. Or is it something about the conditions existing at the moment of the creation of the document, which might be about things about the states of mind of the author or the audience or surrounding conditions and practices, right? That then would be instead originalism. And there's a great deal of confluence and overlap between these things, but they're not the same. And frequently it makes a difference which way you're going. As the idea that something about the moment of the enactment of the constitutional text is important to the meaning of the Constitution, and therefore that if you're trying to interpret the Constitution or make constitutional decisions, you need to know something about that moment. That's an old idea. People in constitutional interpretation have said things about the early moments for as long as there's been constitutional interpretation. And I should maybe specify, originalism in constitutional interpretation isn't only about the 1780s, right? Most of the text of the US Constitution was written in the 1780s. But there are important pieces of it that have been written since in subsequent amendments. Strictly speaking, an originalist is not someone who wants to privilege the 1780s meaning. An originalist is a person who wants to privilege the meaning at the moment of enactment. So if you're an originalist about the 13th Amendment, what you care about is 1865, right? The idea that you talk about, argue about the ideas or intentions or understandings, those are all different things, right? We can talk about what turns on the differences between them, of some group of agents from the time of enactment is old. I mean, all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, people have done that. But the idea that that is a distinct method with a theory and a set of values that it is espousing, rather than just like one more thing that you might say in constitutional conversation, is a relatively modern idea. It has roots maybe going back to the 1930s or even 20s, but it really gets going in its modern form in the 1970s, and then comes to flower in the 1980s in the Reagan Justice Department. And then on the bench in the work of people like Antonin Scalia, nominated to the Supreme Court by President Reagan, and Bates Scalia, like the whole, a cadre of scholars and students, raised up after him. And the link to conservatism runs in a few ways. I mean, the easy way to think about it, which isn't all wrong, but is very partial, is conservatives are more comfortable with the authority of the past than other people are. For reasons that might be good or bad or neither, depending on what part of the puzzle we're in, right? That's an easy take, and there's something to it, but it misses a whole lot, right? Because radicals also sometimes draw on the authority of the past, right? And in fact, here are two different ways of thinking about the authority of the past, right, among many. One is traditionalist and one is fundamentalist, right? The difference is the fundamentalist in law or in religion wants to go back to time zero and ask, like, at the moment of law giving, what was the law? And to see that as the true law, and anything else built on top or developed out of that is corruption or falling away. It's error. It should be swept away, right? And since we don't usually live at time zero and like stuff happens, fundamentalism tends to be radical, right? In the strict sense of radical, it goes to the root, right? And like it wants to like get rid of everything else. A very different approach to the authority of the past is traditionalism, which asks not about time zero, right? It asks, what did we do yesterday? And the day before that, and the day before that. And sometimes there's correspondence between what we did yesterday and the day before that and something from time zero, but a lot of the time there isn't, right? And so there's a real struggle, certainly in American law and in other traditions also, between traditionalist and fundamentalist ways of looking at the past. In American constitutional law, the name we give to the fundamentalist impulse is originalism, right? That's what that is. It's an attempt to ground the law in time zero. And the leading, the traditionalist approach, which as a matter of practice has been the dominant approach in American law, let's say since the end of the 19th century, although it might be changing, is something, it's sometimes called common law constitutionalism. Sometimes it doesn't have a name at all. It's just the practice that we do and we don't theorize it. Where the bread and butter of constitutional decision-making is case law, right? Decisions, right? What did the court decide last time we saw an issue like this? And what other decisions has the court made that are about issues like this? And then we apply the precedent. We analogize and distinguish, right? Very much, like people might in rabbinic, analog forums. And then we make the next decision incrementally, and we build incrementally, right, the body of law. Traditionalism tends to be a relatively status quo oriented approach. Like it's mostly comfortable with most of what we're doing, and the changes we make are going to be incremental. And it reposes, not coincidentally, a high level of trust in the present decision makers, right? Like we see like the decision makers make decisions, those are authoritative, right? Originalism, like fundamentalism generally, is much less trustful in that way. It's radical reformist, right? It wants to oppose the decisions that have been made and sweep them away. And here, the deeper reason why originalism has been mostly a conservative art form in American law, it arises as a distinct theory largely in opposition to the Supreme Court as it existed in the middle third of the 20th century. Usually in English-speaking systems, I don't know more generally, courts are relatively conservative institutions. They're populated by elite decision makers who are mostly people who've done well with status quo institutions, and they tend not to think of themselves institutionally as where the reformist impulse should be. But there was a moment in American law where it wasn't like that. In the 1930s and 40s, in response to the Great Depression, the American federal courts signed off on very bold changes in American government associated with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. The court wasn't the agent of that change, right? But it blessed the change. It said, okay, you want to do that, we're not going to stand in the way. And many conservatives didn't like that at all, for reasons that conservatives didn't like the New Deal more generally. In the 1950s and 60s, the Supreme Court took on Jim Crow segregation in the United States, especially in the American South. The courts became, for a short time, a very important player in pushing forward a set of liberal social agendas on race and on sex, and even for a little moment on poverty. And many conservative legal thinkers reacted very negatively. It's like, this cannot be right, what the Supreme Court is doing here in the 1950s and 60s. And when a bunch of people really don't like what the present decision makers are doing, they articulate their opposition in all kinds of ways, some more thoughtful than others. You can find like any number of complaints raised against the Warren Court, many of them mutually contradictory. But one of the leading themes was they have gone beyond what the framers of the Constitution thought they were doing. They're making up their own stuff. And the way to correct them is to force them to return to the original meaning of the Constitution. And so was born, in opposition to the Warren Court, the movement that became, by the 1980s, originalism as we have it. And it is a tool, or has been a tool, of resistance, right? The wielded by people who didn't like what the modern decision makers were doing, to say, no, you're doing it wrong. We appeal over the head of the present generation of the decision makers to the original lawmaking moment, right? And that's the authority we recognize. And in its name, we say that you have strayed. One of the reasons that this is going to change going forward is that through a combination of like weird electoral results and glitches in the constitutional mechanism, and some other things also, the originalist movement has successfully captured the courts, right? The US Supreme Court, if we had had this conversation 5 years ago, I would have said the Supreme Court is more conservative today than at any point in our lifetimes. And that was against there hasn't been a majority of Democratic appointees on the Supreme Court since 1970. So even after 40 years without a Democratic majority on the Supreme Court, several years ago, I would have said it is now the most conservative it's been in our lifetimes. And today, it's way more conservative than that, right? And it's not just more conservative, it's also more originalist in method. And it's likely to be that way for a while, right? Because the judges serve indefinite tenure. And that means that the present decision makers are, bit by bit, going to make the law in the present more and more conservative. And as that happens, it's less and less going to be conservatives who need tools of opposition to the present decision makers, right? The conservatives are going to become much more comfortable with the institution that we have and the doctrine that we have. And the need for tools of resistance and opposition will pass to the liberals, who will find themselves increasingly appealing over the heads of the present decision makers to things like original meaning.
Mm.
And because original meaning can be read lots of different ways, liberals will find themselves at least as able as conservatives have been to give the original meaning of the Constitution a reading that vindicates the things they're trying to vindicate.
Well, there are two things that what you're saying makes me think about in terms of what we've been talking about, which are related. One is that in the traditional reading of the Talmud, and partly by design and partly, I think, just by failure to, or maybe an inability to do some of the academic digging through and finding the layers, everything gets crunched together as like one work. And so when we see certain things happening, we don't necessarily realize that this was in reaction to maybe a period of 100 years of a more conservative period, or vice versa. And Benet and I have been trying to tease some of that out, and we have certain theories about who were the liberals and who were the conservatives and what might, but we don't necessarily know what they might have been reacting to. So Rava, for example, one of the heroes of the Talmud and one of our heroes, he's what we would call a progressive, let's say. But what is he reacting to? What was the society like that he was entering into? We don't really know, or we don't know, and we haven't been able to get an answer yet from somebody else. So that's an interesting piece. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about as you're talking is specifically that famous story of the Oven of Achnai, where Rabbi Joshua basically says to God, a sort of originalist, but originalist progressive argument. He says, God, you had one chance to speak when you, at the moment, what you call the moment of enactment, right? When you gave the Torah, that was your chance. If you messed up and you didn't actually restrict us in a certain way that maybe you meant to, but you didn't get it right in the text, and you said, it's not in the heavens, for example, and he misreads that as meaning that you've given us the power to, it's like, well, God, if you wanted to say that wasn't what you meant, you should have written it more clearly in the Torah. So that's like a kind of, it's original, I think, what would you call it? It's like, it's originalism, but it's like originalism of absence rather than an originalism trying to interpret what the text is actually saying.
Right. The story of Achnai's oven has a very strong resonance also in the other direction, because what Rabbi Joshua's move does is privilege the present decision makers, right? That is, say, in the same moment, when you say it's not in heaven, or at least in that instance, when Joshua says it's not in heaven, he doesn't just destroy the possibility that his opponents will assign a heavenly meaning to the law and defeat him. He also undermines his own ability to win the argument by persuading them about what the heavenly meaning of the law is, right? He's just thrown back on his own argumentation. Now, like, I must convince you, right? Because we're going to decide here among us, which in American law is a very anti-originalist impulse, right? It's a present, because in American law, one of the opposites of originalist authority is presentist authority. Right? One of the big criticisms of originalism as a theory of American law is we're supposed to be running a democracy here, right? And the more authority you vest in a time long ago, especially when you say that authority can't be changed by ordinary law, right? There's like the Talmud is hard to amend, right? The Constitution is not quite as hard to amend, but almost, right? To amend the U.S. Constitution formally, you need a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress and a 3/4 vote, and an affirmative vote of 3/4 of the state legislatures, 38 legislatures, and some of those legislatures have their own supermajority rules, which means if you can hold on to 13 state legislative chambers spread anywhere across the country to oppose a change, you can block change forever. And 13 out of 99 is not such a high bar, for someone who wants to oppose a change. So one of the major problems that people raise about originalism in constitutional law is it's a theory that says our democracy is limited in what we can choose to do and how we can govern ourselves on the authority of decisions made long ago, right, at meetings that we were not present in. And we really can't change it very much. And if that sounds anti-democratic, and if we're going to give more strength to the idea that we really should be self-governing. We need ways of being able to make more of our own law rather than just being subject to law that we didn't choose and cannot very easily change. Right? Rabbi Joshua's move is I think meant to ameliorate that problem in some ways. Right? He's saying we here are gonna make some decisions.
My brain is exploding with questions. Okay, so I want to come clean that what I'm hoping to do in this next hour, maybe now a half hour, is to understand what's going on for the rabbis, right? You're an expert in interpreting the sacred document, the Torah of America, right? That's the Constitution. And as you know, the Talmud is written in a kind of double speak. You suspect that the rabbis are saying one thing, but really meaning something else. They're justifying decisions by pointing to verses in the Torah sometimes, when you suspect by the forced nature of their interpretation of those verses that they don't really stand behind those proofs. And at other times, they very baldly justify radical moves by saying, it's what my kishki tells me. It's svara. And so I have lots of questions for you. One is, I noticed that the rabbis only name svara as operating for them very rarely compared to how often they at least pretend to be pointing to verses. And my suspicion is because legal systems fall apart, trust in systems fall apart when you make it clear that it's the judicial discretion or decision making at work. I'd love to hear what you say about that. And I'm particularly interested in something you bring out in one of your articles where you say that judicial decision making and judicial discourse are two different things, that judges might talk one way and operate another way. So I'll just stop there with my questions. You can
Sure.
speak to any of those things.
Sure. So, I mean, they're great questions. I want to start by saying judges are different people from each other, right? Like different judges are a little bit differently. It's when we talk about how judges think and what practices judges engage in, we have to recognize that there are actually a few different things that different people are going on, and that the mix of things they're doing is different for different of them, but it may be mostly the same mix, right? Just like with the ingredients in different proportions in different places. So there is in American legal theory an idea that we call the autonomy of law. The autonomy of law has a picture of legal decision-making that is, in the technical sense, formalist. The law is a product of rules. It's as close to algorithmic as we can make it. And it doesn't mean there are no hard questions, but it does mean that the way cases come out should not in any way be a function of the decision maker, right? And the law as a discipline for deciding things this is why we call it the autonomy of law, autonomous of the values of the decision makers and also the cultural currents of the society. Like if you don't like the law, you shouldn't lobby the judicial decision makers. There are mechanisms for changing the law. They're usually legislative, and that's how you do it. And when we're doing interpretation and adjudication, we're doing something that is autonomous of all those other cultural, right, and morally laden things. Not a lot of leading law professors believe that the autonomy of law actually describes how judicial decision making work, right? We differ among ourselves often in assessing how far away from that we are, right? I myself very much think that who the decision makers are matters, and that the cultural currents of society matter an awful lot, not mostly because judges think my job is to implement the values of society, but because they can't help it. Like they're products of a society and they have a certain common sense. And whether they want to or not, they're going to translate that common sense into their decision making, right, in a lot of cases. But I also want to avoid the other pole, right? There's also a school of thought that says all the things that judges say about rules, right? Be it the text of the Constitution or precedential decisions or anything else, right? The stuff that's analogous, B'nai, in what you're talking about too, like when they quote the verse from the Torah, right? That's all smoke and mirrors. And what they do is, those are not their reasons. That's just a show that they put on, right? Really, they're doing something else, and they're just doing what they think is right. I think that's wrong too. In the American system, it's not to say that I don't think that ever happens, right? There are a lot of judges in our system, but I don't think that's what's happening most of the time. I think most of the time, judges have the experience of being constrained by authority. I think they have the experience of following rules. I think they have the experience of trying to solve the puzzle of the case in front of them. And I think that in most cases that walk in the door of a courtroom, there actually is a right answer on the basis of existing legal authority that 10 out of 10 competent judges will come to. It's just that those aren't the cases we talk about in the common law class, right? Because they're easy, right? Those are the easy cases. Jewish law also has easy cases, right? They're not the ones we argue about. We argue about the hard cases. And what makes there are two things that could make a hard case hard, right? One is there might be a right answer, but it's complicated, right? You got to work for a while to figure it out, right? The other is there's not a unique right answer to this one. You can make better and worse arguments, but this question is not fully answered by pre-existing authority. And here the interpreter has to be maybe creative, has to exercise judgment. That exercise of judgment and creativity need not reduce to like, what do I want? And then make it go that way. Sometimes it's a question of asking, okay, like, what if I try to make sense of this set of materials as a whole? You know, what do I think, you know, that should lead me to? But those are the places where different judges' values and different judges' common sense about what justice is, about how government is supposed to function, those things will play, and they'll play reliably. And I think everyone knows this. You know, I mean, when we fight in politics over who's going to be appointed to the Supreme Court, it's not usually because we don't think that person is a competent lawyer. It's because we think that person has a different common sense of how the government should function from some other person. And therefore, in this small but important set of cases, the common sense will go differently. Now, skilled judges definitely know how to pull sources and arguments to make the argument point in a particular direction. But that doesn't mean that they're not constrained by the fact that those are the arguments, and also by the fact that, and also I think they're somewhat constrained by the need to give an explanation to an audience, right, that is going to judge them, right? But I do think that judges, even when they're very smart people, like the rest of us, are often not fully self-conscious about what they're doing. And that it's in any thick normative culture, we have practices of saying things that don't make sense taken at face value, but that we recognize as, you know, ways of expressing other ideas that we just sort of agree to treat as reasonable. Maybe it's a particularly bad week to give this example, but it's usually a pretty good example. God save the Queen, right? To this day, statutes of Parliament in the UK are prefaced with "be it enacted by, you know, Her Most Gracious Majesty." Nobody thinks the Queen legislates, right? That's not what that means. Or for most Jews I know, next year in Jerusalem, right? It doesn't express actually an intention to be in Jerusalem next year, right? It expresses something else. You can invoke that idea sometimes in an argument to push someone in a certain way by making salient a certain kind of values or certain community connection. American law has lots of things that are like that. I don't think the judges are always fully conscious, just as I don't think that, you know, that the Jews are always fully conscious about, like, what that I'm saying is actually the rule that motivates me, and what that I'm saying is a conventional thing that we say because we're part of this community.
And tell me if I'm right. One thing I learned from reading a bit of your scholarship is that it's not like one judge is a textualist, period, and is a textualist and uses that method in all cases, but different kinds of cases might induce the judge to utilize different interpretive tools.
Yes, I think that's definitely true. And it's true along a couple of different dimensions, right? Some articulate and theorized and some less so. Articulate and theorized might go like this. The Constitution is not the only source of legal authority in American court, right? There's the Constitution. There are statutes passed by legislatures. There are cases decided by courts. There are regulations, ordained by administrative bodies. And there are very sophisticated legal theorists who will say, I should use different tools for making decisions on the basis of these different kinds of texts, because they are different kinds of texts, and I need to understand differently how they're produced and what I'm supposed to do with them. Here's an example. Not from the, I'll come to law in a moment, but just to make the point really clear. Over the domain of most constitutional decision making, I'm not primarily an originalist, but there are texts about which I am an originalist. So for example, I'm an originalist about the grocery shopping list. I haven't been to a supermarket in a year, but if I go to the grocery store carrying a document, right, and the document says 2 eggs, and I come home with 2 eggs, I have failed, right? And when my wife says to me, what are you doing with 2 eggs? You're supposed to have 24 eggs, right? Because what I mean by 2 eggs is 2 dozen eggs. And it is no defense on my part to say, but you wrote 2 eggs, right? Like that's there's a clever stage of intelligent development, maybe when you're about 11, when you think that's a good defense and it's very funny and your parent is proud of you for making the move. But when you actually go grocery, that's not how you do grocery shopping. That's not how you use a grocery list, right? When I go to the grocery store, if it's a list that my wife wrote and I'm the person who went, I'm acting as her agent. And as her agent, my responsibility is to use the document to accomplish what she wanted to be accomplished, which I'm supposed to know means 2 dozen eggs. And that's on me, right? If I decide not to be an originalist about that text. But maybe when the text is the Constitution, it's different. Because we the Americans today, we're not the agents of a principal who wrote the Constitution in the 18th century, right? That's not the relationship that we have with them. That they say what to do and we're just here to carry. No, right? So that rationale for treating the document that way falls away. So about each text, and about each text within the law, you have to ask, okay, what project am I supposed to be engaged in with this guidance, right? And you have to apply the set of interpretive tools that match that project. Most judges, I think even most smart judges, don't have fully worked out answers to the question, so what am I supposed to do? A lot of judges just use the tools that come to mind. But but some judges do. Justice Scalia, with whom I disagreed about a lot of things, I want to give proper credit. He had a different theory of statutory interpretation from his theory of constitutional interpretation. It's it's a different text. I got to do a different kind of thing with it.
The thing that you were saying about that it's a different America, we're not necessarily their agents. It's just got me thinking about this project of the Talmud, but also how we're trying to look at the Talmud. So sometimes, for example, we've talked about, again, back to that Avnei Vachnai story, we've talked about how Rabbi Eliezer in that story, he's actually right in the sense that he's saying, but it says this in the Torah, he's saying, right, and B'nai calls him a verse pointer, and he's saying, but it says it right here. And Rabbi Joshua basically says, well, we don't listen to that, or we're going to read it different. And one of the things that we've taken from that is to say, well, maybe that's what ultimately Rabbi Joshua is telling us to do that to him 2,000 years from now, when the version of saying, but this is what Rabbi Joshua would have wanted, isn't right anymore. And
Yes.
it's actually more true to Rabbi Joshua's who he was, to reverse, to say we don't follow Rabbi Joshua anymore, because the whole point of Rabbi Joshua is to say we don't follow, the verse pointing anymore. And I'm just thinking about and I don't know if this exactly fits to what you're saying, but I'm thinking about that old document, that the Constitution, the Talmud, is like a seed being planted, and out of that grows a tree, and the law of the tree is different from the law of the seed. And so just to go back and sort of read the seed document as if that 200 years or 2,000 years didn't happen is a mistake.
Yes. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, with whom I disagree about many things in constitutional law, I think he was a man who did not take the Constitution very seriously, actually, wrote, "You might as well require a man to wear the coat that fit him when he was a boy," right? As to, right, completely, and he said, as to, demand, I'm not getting the second part of the quote verbatim correct, as to demand, that a people remain in law forever under the regime of their barbarous ancestors, right? Like we change, right? So, but. So I agree with you about Rabbi Joshua. That to say, I don't see any other sensible application of Rabbi Joshua except to say, okay, you were the decision maker at that moment, you made the decision, but you don't get to make this. Okay. Part of what Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Eliezer are arguing about is, what is our process of legal decision making, right? You can say, but it says right here, and that works if you have consensus in your legal culture that saying, but it says right here, wins the argument. And if we imagine Rabbi Eliezer as shocked when this happens, it's because he thinks that's the culture he inhabits. And what's happening to him is he's being confronted with the fact that it isn't, right? Or at least it's not on this day, right? But there's a way in which the joke is also on Rabbi Joshua, because verse pointing hasn't gone away. Joshua made his claim a very long time ago, and people still verse point a lot in Jewish law, right? They do it, I think, because it's hardwired into Jewish culture that the Torah matters, right? It's hardwired into Jewish culture that the Torah matters in a big way, right? And that makes the text of the Torah an easily mobilizable resource in any argument in Jewish law, right? It hasn't gone away, right? If it had gone away, that would be different. But it's lying around, right? And one of the things that we do is point to it. Similarly, the Constitution functions. Like Benet said, it's the Torah of America. In a bunch of ways, that's true, right? It's an easily accessible text, right? I mean, here's one of my copies, and it's only one of the copies that I could reach, right now, right? It's not all that long. Anyone literate can pick it up and open it and start pointing at verses. And even though it is the case, and really important point of analogy. If you walked into an observant Jewish community today, halakhically observant, and all you knew was the text of the Pentateuch, you would have a hard time saying, oh yes, everything lines up, this corresponds, right? The law and practice is all from here, right? Similarly, an anthropologist who came to the United States and studied how our government functions would be very hard pressed to reverse engineer the Constitution that we have from it, right? There's a lot of disconnect between the text of the Constitution and the way our government actually functions. We are committed as a matter of public principle, and I think as a matter of sincere belief among a lot of us, to the proposition the Constitution is authoritative. But we also are committed to a lot of practices that are hard to square with that belief, unless you choose to ignore things, So here are a couple of easy examples. Can the President of the United States order uniformed members of the armed services to attend Mass and take communion, right, Catholic Church style, on the eve of battle? Every properly socialized American, including every American lawyer, knows the answer to this question is no, right? And if that ever happened and you told me to do something about it, I would like walk downtown to federal court and I get you an injunction in 12 seconds. It's the easiest case there is, right? Why? Well, every American knows the answer is the First Amendment. But I have a problem. Go read the First Amendment. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The President's not Congress. I understand that there are a lot of words in the Constitution that are open to interpretation. What exactly is the free exercise of religion? We have legitimate arguments about that. But if Congress can mean president, then the authority of the text is not doing the thing that people who think the text have authority is doing, right? You can't get there from here, right? But I've not yet met the law student. Well, that's not true. I've rarely met the law student, and I've never met the practicing lawyer who says, oh, I guess you're right. I guess the president can do that, right? Can Congress enact a law that sets income tax for white people at 20% and income tax for everybody else at 40%? We all know, of course not, right? And if you ask the lawyer or the law student why not, the first answer is the Equal Protection Clause, right, which is a part of the 14th Amendment. The trouble is the Equal Protection Clause starts no state shall. Congress is not a state either, right? Now, the culture of constitutional law has ritualized explanations for these things, right? Midrash, essentially, right? It says, oh, true, that text doesn't say this, but we have this other text in this other place that the untutored reader, competent in English and not socialized into our culture, would never have any clue meant, that Congress can't do that, but which we have decided to say means that Congress can't do that. And part of what you learn when you learn the craft of being a constitutional lawyer is the ritualized explanations for how you get the text and the practice to line up, which you could never intuit by yourself because they're not actually functions of the text, right? The thing is, that's my explanation, right? There are other people who are, are intelligent folks who are tenured professors of law at respected American law schools who take the ritualized, what I call ritualized explanations much more seriously. So, no, Richard, this is not some ritualized, indirection meant to rationalize a practice and let us hold on to the idea that we are applying the Constitution. That's really what it is. Like, that's the real explanation. And on the quality of that explanation depends whether Congress can tax people differently according to race. My view is no. Like, there are some things that are actually from the text, and there are some things that are inferences from the text, and there are some things that are stories that we tell to staple things that are important to us to the text, to preserve what is one of our most important values of the system, which is our ability to continue to say and to believe in good faith that the Constitution is our supreme law. And I think that that's a thing that goes on in Jewish law too, regularly, rampantly, right? I would say, even though I know I've talked a while here, but if you'll forgive me, I'll push it just a little this way. A few years ago, in the Cornell Law Review, I wrote a little essay called "The Constitutional Constant," in which I say essentially this: what is a constant and what is a variable in constitutional law? The orthodox picture is what the field calls the pre-commitment picture. The Constitution makes rules at time one that can be enforced at time two, because we're worried that if we let ourselves make the decision unconstrained at time two, we'll make the decision badly, right? Because at time two, we'll be scared, or at time two, we'll be weak and lack resolve, or at time two, we'll want to get something done, and so will run roughshod over, someone who's weak, right? So we're going to make decisions now, right? Sometimes the model is Odysseus and the Sirens, right? He ties himself to the mast so that he won't make the bad decision that he knows to make. Sometimes we say the Constitution is the people sober, legislating for the people drunk, right? That's one model of how constitutional lawmaking works. And on that model, what's constant is the content of the rules. And for the system to work, that has to be constant. That's the orthodox model. And common law does work that way sometimes, right? We don't decide each time how long the president serves. The president serves 4 years. But a lot of the time, that's not how common law works. A lot of the time, there's a different thing that's constant, and it's this. The Constitution is the repository of the deepest values and highest aspirations of the American people. That is constant. That is hardwired. That will not change. The thing is, the content of the deepest values and highest aspirations of the American people does change, right? How could it not? I can't always predict how it will change. It might change in ways I do like, but it's gonna change through all of history, right? People change. And that means that if the constitutional constant is gonna be maintained, if it's going to continue to be true that we regard the Constitution as the repository of our deepest values and highest aspirations, as our highest law, the Constitution has to change its content. And if we had a Constitution that was easily amendable, right, formally, we would change by amendment, but we have a Constitution that's almost impossible to amend. But it must change to preserve the constant. And the mechanism for change is that whether we mean to or not, we reinterpret it. We reinterpret it to keep it true that it reflects our deepest values and highest aspirations. Because if we did not reinterpret it, there would arise a dissonance between what we think the Constitution says and who we think we are, and we will not tolerate that. Who we are as Americans is a people who do not tolerate that dissonance.
That's fascinating. Okay, tell me if I've got this right. So the constitutional constant isn't what the Constitution says. It's the fact that the Constitution must match our changing and enlarging or narrowing understanding of our deepest values and highest aspirations. Did I get that right?
That's right. And usually when you have collapsed perfectly accurately. What I usually put in two different propositions, and I'll tell you why. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your formulation. Usually I say proposition one, because I'm talking to an audience that's resistant to this idea, right? So the proposition one, the Constitution is the repository of the deepest values and highest aspirations of the American people. Everyone nods, right? Everyone agrees with that. Proposition two, the content of those values and aspirations changes over time, right? And then, that's just empirical. And if one and if two, the content of the Constitution's got to change.
Fabulous. Okay, I got another question for you. Going back to Law 101.
Yeah.
All of my students can rattle off for you the 5 sources of law reflected in Jewish jurisprudence in the Talmud. That's Kra, Minhag, Ma'aseh, Takana, Svara. Torah verses, custom, precedent, legislation, and moral intuition. And they will also know that only 2 of those, another verse or a verse and moral intuition, of those 5 have the power to overturn Torah. Okay. And I always tell them, I always say, if there are any lawyers in the room, and of course there are always lawyers in the room in the Beit Midrash, this will sound familiar to you because it's just how law works. But I actually don't know, are there, is there a set of sources that simple? And are some of them available only to overturn the Constitution? How does that work? Okay.
Wonderful. So the answer is yes. Right. I mean, what you're talking about is the grammar of an argument, right? What counts as an argument, right, in this conversation, right? And in your conversation, these are the 5 things that count as an argument, right? And what it means to be a properly socialized participant in an argument, rather than a person who no one can understand, right, is that you know what counts as an argument here, right? There's been more than one attempt. Now, I don't know, you might tell, I'd be super interested to know from you, B'nai. I don't know how articulate the rabbis of the Talmud were about your list of 5, and how much they exercised it as a matter of craft in the way that a native speaker knows the grammar of the language, right? Most constitutional lawyers, good ones, have a craft native speaker sense of what the arguments are. There's been more than one attempt to render that grammar into something like the list of 5, right? Because I mean, this is what grammarians do, right? This is like my 4th grade grammar teacher, to whom I mean no disrespect, right, taught me, like, these are the rules of English grammar, and like you apply them. Whereas then I got older and I learned, no, what that means is that, like, there are people who speak English as native speakers, and these are attempts to systematize what they do most of the time, right?
Yes.
So, the shortest list is misleading, right? But everyone at least agrees on this. Of the constitutional, we sometimes call them the modalities of argument. I don't love the term, but we often use it. The shortest list is text, history, and structure. Structure, all of those things are ambiguous, right? Text, when we say text, history, and structure, what we say text means is the words of the enacted Constitution. That might mean the meaning of the language. It might mean something about how the words in the Constitution relate to each other, right? But like, it's the kind of argument that you can do within the 4 corners of a document. History means a few different things, right? It includes both what I called originalist argument and what I called traditionalist argument. If you're talking like where, if it's the kind of traditionalist argument that says the government has always done it this way, right? The government has always done it this way. That creates a presumption, not a conclusive presumption, but a presumption that it's constitutional. Because we don't presume that the way everyone has always done it is wrong, right? I believe on your side of the street, B'nai, we say minhag avotenu biadenu, right? Or it's like one of several things that we might say to invoke this idea, right? Yeah. Structure, which is super interesting, is deeply ambiguous as between at least these things. 1, the structure of the document. Like the US Constitution has Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Article 1 is about Congress, Article 2 is about the president, Article 3 is about the courts. We got some other articles also. Sometimes when you go to interpret a document, it matters where this text is, right? This is, source critics will say, that's not in Genesis, that's in Deuteronomy. The same sentence might mean something very different, right? So there, the assumption is because by a different author in different times and different circumstances, right? With this kind of structural reading of the Constitution, Article 1 and Article 3 were written on the same day, and approved at the same time by the same people. But it matters. This is Article 1 and this is Article 3. It's about different. That's one thing that structural argument can mean. The other more interesting thing that structural argument can mean is not the structure of the document, but the structure of the machine, the government, the institutions. Like, we have a Congress. What kind of a beast is Congress? We have federalism, not just an idea, but as a going concern. Like, what does the central government do and what is it good at? What do the local governments do and what are they good at? What are the distinctive decision-making pathologies to which each kind of decision-making institution is more subject, right? These are questions about the structure of the machine, right? And you make an argument about those things sometimes to figure out what to do. Sometimes the lines among the arguments blur. When someone says, I'm making you a structural argument, one question always to ask them is, are you really making me an argument about the structure of the machine as a going concern? Or are you making me an argument about structure that relies on something like, let's say, reading the Federalist Papers, where they talked about what the federal government will do and what the state governments will do? That's an originalist argument about how people thought the machine should work. And sometimes knowing how people thought the machine should work is illuminating. But don't confuse it with knowing how the machine works, right? Like if you take your car to the mechanic, and the mechanic, can read the manual that was written when your car was new 20 years ago, or the mechanic can look at your engine. Sometimes what you want the mechanic to do is look at the engine, right, and not at the okay. Text, history, and structure. I'll say one more thing about these, and then I'll expand the list. The conventional view is that that's a hierarchy. Text, then history, then structure. The most important kind of argument is the text. Judges often say we start with the text, right? And you have to write, and the text governs if it speaks. I have a different view about how argument works in practice. I think in practice, the arguments that win in hard cases are the arguments where the structural arguments and the historical arguments make sense. They say, where structure makes sense means if you decide this way, the machine will work properly. And the historical argument means, because what is history for in constitutional argument? It's for a bunch of different things. Sometimes it's data about how the machine works. Sometimes it's a record of authority. But sometimes it's identity, right? It's narrative. It's the story of who we are. And we make the great Robert Cover, a law professor who also dabbled on both sides of the line that we're talking about, wrote a wonderful essay in the Harvard Law Review many years ago called Nomos and Narrative, right? On the idea that a legal system imports a set of stories, and they're mutually supporting, right? So if you can tell me a good story about, this is law in general, not just con law. I frequently have to remind my students, whoever tells the best story wins. And in con law, the story that you're trying to tell it's a good story is, who are we, the American people? If you tell that story in a convincing way, and you have a good structural argument, right, and your solution will make the machine work well, the text has a way of coming along for the ride. They say, once we learn what those things require, we're very good at reading the text to point in the same direction. So I usually like to when I have students at a certain advanced point, to explain, yeah, if you read what the judges say, they say we start with the text, and maybe they think that way, or maybe some of them, but really we end with the text, right? Some of the most skilled rhetoricians in American constitutional history have known this. If you read the greatest opinions of the Chief Justice John Marshall, and you note the order in which he makes his arguments, the text comes late. Because his strategy is, by the time I start talking to you about the text of the Constitution, you should already be persuaded that my substantive resolution is the right one. If I can convince you of that, I can get you to read the text my way. If you don't think that, you're not going to read the text my way. So, text, history, structure. There are more. One really wonderful contemporary law professor who knows a thing or two about Jewish interpretation also, who actually says that a fair amount of how he thinks about text and interpretation and law was from many, many, many readings as a child of the Haggadah, and I believe him, has recently published a paper in which he counts something like 14 different kinds of argument. You can group them as 14, you can group them as 6, right? But the basic category, there's text, history, structure, there's precedent, right? Which means both the precedent of government practice and judicial case law. There's ethos, right? Who we think we are as a people, and it's appeal to values, and usually that appeal is strongest when it comes embedded in a story, right, about who we are. There's prudence, like um, there's institutional capacity. Like, yeah, you're making me a really good argument about what the law should be. But if I order that, it's going to be a disaster, right? Why? Because people won't listen to me if I order that, right? And then the authority of the system will crumble. Or because I don't have the authority to order the 3 other things that would be necessary to make your thing work, right? It's an argument from institutional capacity. Formally, well, when you talk about what's necessary to overturn, right? The thing that we normally talk about overturning in con law is judicial precedent. Like, will we overturn Plessy versus Ferguson when we get to Brown versus Education, Board of Education? Will we overturn Roe versus Wade? Will we overturn Citizens United? The strong originalism is valuable to the people to whom it is valuable in part because it is a form of argument capable of overturning precedent, because it's an appeal to the fundamental. But if you ask me, what you really need to convince people of, to convince them then to read the originalist sources in the way that would get them to overturn, is about structure and about values and about narrative.
Would you say that's what Kennedy was doing in the Lawrence decision?
I think, well, I have never been a fan of Justice Kennedy. I should explain that. I'm a fan of Lawrence, and I'm a fan of Romer and Obergefell and several other decisions that he made. His opinions, I think, as a matter of craft, are dog's breakfasts. They're not really well theorized. But if you ask what's he channeling in something like Lawrence, yeah, that's a lot of it.
Well, so I guess we're out of time, but I mean, we've said this before with guests, and we've said this before with things that we've studied, that you usually end a chapter of Talmud by saying Hadran Allah will return to you. So hopefully it's more that you'll return to us. But I really thank you, Richard, for this really great conversation that's going to get us, I think, thinking in new ways, and I hope that we could continue it.
Anytime. It's delightful to see and talk to both of you, and to learn with you about these wonderful things.
Richard, thank you so much.
All right, we'll see you next week.